On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the verdict on Trump's 100 days and the latest on the reconciliation process. Joining us to discuss all of this are AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin and Director of Fiscal Policy Jordan Haring. Doug, thanks for joining us.
It is always a pleasure to be here.
So before we jump into everything and talk about economy and 100 days, what's been on your mind?
The sovereign wealth fund idea.
Yeah.
I had genuinely hoped that there would be this executive order and it told the Secretary of the Treasury, go think about this, that the Secretary of the Treasury would think about it and just quietly tell the President, this is a no-go. But it appears to not be dead. And I don't understand what kind of magical thinking is going on that would suggest this is a good idea. The latest version is they're going to monetize the federal government's balance sheet. Right, so this is clearly the problem with putting a hedge fund guy as Secretary of Treasury. So let's sell off some land and do cash. We can sell off our Bitcoin. Oh wait, we're creating a Bitcoin reserve. Can't do that. The federal government does have assets, but its real assets are the power to tax, the most powerful tool that it has, and things like that, and national parks and the Washington Monument and things you're not going to monetize. So I question the ability to monetize much. There are some financial assets out there, student loans, but we carry them overvalued on the federal books. So that when you sell them in the private sector, you lose money instead of raising money. So that's not good. So I don't know, first of all, where they're going to get the money. And the second thing is when you take something and put it on the into the stock market and call it a sovereign wealth fund, you're introducing risk to the taxpayers. Yeah. And they don't, if they wanted that risk, they could invest themselves. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to me from a sort of public policies, fiscal policy point of view. And then ultimately, they're trying to bypass Congress, and that seems like a bad idea to me. Yeah. So I was hoping this idea would die, and it seemingly has not.
Yeah, because this came up during the campaign at least once or twice, and then it came. I think it probably mentioned it when he first started, but it seemed to have just died down. And then you brought it up today. I'm like, wait, this is a blast from the past.
Yeah, and I'm hoping it remains a blast from the past, but keep an eye on it. Yeah. Bad idea. Yeah. Again, they're talking about doing a crypto reserve too. We'll see if that materializes. Yeah. That's also a bad idea.
Yeah, and I mean, by the way, we still have running debts and deficits, so maybe we should.
Sure.
Yeah. I didn't think that would be news to you, Doug. I mean,
shouldn't there have been a memo?
Yeah. I think there's been quite a few.
Yeah, I know.
And so that's. Again, this is stuff Congress should be dealing with, like you said, and not building these sovereign wealth funds when you don't have the reserve to do it anyways.
It would be great if we had a surplus. We had to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's turn to the first 100 days.
Okay.
The Trump administration has, of course, completed its first 100 days in office. From an economic perspective, what has it accomplished, and where have they come up short?
Well, I think you can go down the four big areas. There's the immigration area, and they've been very successful at securing the southern border, northern border too, presumably. Deportations are getting a lot of attention. I don't know, from an economic point of view, that's really not a consequential thing. The big economics is in legal immigration, and we will need more legal immigrants in the future, given our demography. So they've done nothing on that front. The president had said on the campaign trail he was open to stapling a green card on a STEM graduate's diploma. So maybe something will come of that, but that requires legislation. We've seen nothing. Incomplete, I guess you say. Then you've got the regulation, deregulation portfolio. That's a work in progress. They've got all the tools. They've got the budgets. They've said every agency should aim to do as well as they did in 2017 or better. And that was in a year when there was very little in terms of regulatory costs. They have the 1 in, 10 out rule, where it used to be 1 in, 2 out, but they've broadened the things that are eligible for being tossed out, things like letters of guidance or memoranda of guidance. So those don't get published in the Federal Register, so we don't know if they're doing that. Probably doing some of that. But that has the chance to be quite dramatic, and so I think that looks like it's on track to be very successful in the first 100 days. We just don't really know what's happening yet. Tax and fiscal stuff, well, we know this story, and we'll talk about it some more. reconciliation process is still in progress, and and incomplete on that front. And then we've got the tariffs, and I think it would be hard to describe the tariffs as anything other than an unmitigated disaster at this point. There was the nature of the rollout, unexpected pause, on off, all that. The scale is enormous, and people keep thinking, oh, Trump's been figured it out. He's done a U-turn. He blinked, whatever you want to call it, because he suspended the reciprocal tariffs, and now he's eased somewhat the auto tariffs. But the reality is we still have a 10% universal tariff on the books. We've never had that before. It's an enormous one. We have tariffs on China and Mexico and Canada, and we have steel, aluminum, autos. They're still there, and then we have more promised. We've got drugs and chips and wood and copper. So all that adds up to just the largest tariff increase in 100 years, and I think that's a big reason why we got some poor economic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so on the tariff front, do you see any? Could we see a pivot? Is there any indication there's a pivot here, other than
he in his first term he responded to pressures, and as I've mentioned to you before, essentially gutted some of his tariffs. So he left the steel tariffs on the books, but he exempted Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Germany. Basically, anyone who sends us steel got exempted. You could see him starting to do that. The auto thing was a little step in that direction. You could see that happening on other fronts as well. So he can do that. He can just declare, we have a great trade deal with Vietnam. We love it. Not going to do a reciprocal tariff. Just got a great trade deal with Japan. Love it. Who knows what will be in those? You could just drop those and they'd be gone. So and Canada and Mexico, I think you could get rid of tomorrow. I don't understand why they're there. The sticky thing is China, where he and Xi are just locked in a, I'm not going to move first sort of showdown. And the 10% tariff, where it's his idea. There's no one to negotiate with. He's not the kind of person who says, I made a mistake and pulls it down. So my latest thinking on that front is Congress might need to save him from himself and just take away his authority to levy that. So.
Yeah, and then on the regulation front, I mean, it's been kind of quiet, but
I thought surprisingly quiet.
I thought it was going to be a big part of his first 100 days.
It was a big part of his first 100 days in 2017. 17 if I remember right. Congressional Review Act resolutions signed by the president. I think we're at 8 now. And we're running out of time, so didn't see that. We haven't seen dramatic taking up of Biden era regs. So that has been a surprise.
Yeah.
And since those regulatory costs are costs, they are an offset to tariff costs if they get rid of some regulation costs. So I would have thought they'd go aggressively on that.
I mean, it would
just
make
doesn't
sense.
seem like they have.
It would make sense that you do this tariff and regulation thing simultaneously, take pressure off the economy as you're trying.
One tariff in, one regulation out.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, but speaking of which, we heard about this 10-to-1 rule that they said they were going to do, and I haven't.
So we can't track that.
Yeah.
But they could easily inform us of it, take credit for it.
Yeah.
Agency by agency announce,
here are the 10 rules we got rid of for the one rule we just did.
Right.
It seems that would be, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of press around that, which I found very, very interesting in the first 100 days.
It is a surprise.
So
that is not what I expected.
Yeah, and then I imagine that anything, just for the first pillar that you mentioned on the immigration front, I imagine that it would take a lot longer, and it's probably not a priority on the stapling agreement.
Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it. But I mean, again, this is kind of like the dealing with the deficit and the debt, right? At some point you gotta.
Yeah.
And so it's another at some point you gotta moment. That moment is not now.
How much of immigration is being of their platform is being put into like the reconciliation bill? I don't want to get too far ahead of Jordan, but
I think they'll try to get as much as they can in. The question is, what will the parliamentarian leave in?
Yeah.
Since it's ultimately a question of, is it genuinely budgetary in nature?
Right. All right, let's turn to the economy, which is, of course, it's been a big week for the economy. We got a lot of information this week. We got a flood of data. today.
Yes.
From the last 2 weeks, we're going to get more on Friday with jobs numbers. So, inflation, the labor market, GDP growth. What have we learned?
I think we've learned the following. Looking back, we had a relatively modest March on the inflation front. That was true with the CPI. It's been true with the PCE price index, which came out at 10 o'clock this morning. But that doesn't mean every part of the first quarter was that way. If you look at the first quarter GDP report, the fact that the top line growth rate was negative 0.3 has gotten all the attention. The quarterly inflation rate, the core PCE price index for that quarter is 3.5%, up, not down. So you've got an economy that's faltering, and you have an inflation rate that's rising. Those are conflicting parts of the dual mandate for the Fed, so that's trouble. Right? That's landing them right in the place they were afraid they were going to be. Now, I don't think anyone should believe the negative 0.3 number at face value. There's an enormous amount of influence from the timing due to the tariffs. So we saw a big surge in imports. That's getting ahead of the tariffs. We saw a lot of that go into inventories, big bounce up in inventories. We saw a big boost in equipment investment at 22% annual rate. That's all just getting my capital goods into the country and installing them. So if you strip out all that stuff, you've got a growth rate that's something like 1.25% to 1.5%. So it's weaker than the 2.4 in the fourth quarter, no question about it. And the troubling weakness in there is consumer spending on goods. Especially durable goods, very soft. Most of the anecdotes, you and I even had this conversation, were about consumers also buying ahead of the tariffs.
Yeah.
Let's get my big ticket item in advance. It's not in the data. That's or it is in the data, and the underlying trend's even worse.
Yeah.
And so that to me is the most troubling part of that whole report.
Yeah, that is troubling because, like you said, I think on the last podcast we talked about how everyone is just going to be buying ahead, new appliances, even smaller things. Like I just bought a whole bunch of new clothes because I'm like, it's a smaller item, but I want to get that done before
get it done.
I'm paying $60 for a pair of pants rather than just $29.99.
Well, if it's $10 from China, it's going to be $24 post tariffs.
Yeah.
So that adds up.
Yeah, it was interesting earlier this week when Amazon was, that news story out there that Amazon was going to add price transparency with tariffs to their stuff, and then that got shut down pretty quickly. But
hey, look, if you believe in tariffs, you shouldn't be ashamed to have them on there. I don't think I didn't love that episode at all, to be honest. So on the economy, that's all history. We also got ADP report for April, so we're starting to see the first data post-Liberation Day, and it was a very soft report, 62,000 jobs, and weakness, a decline in a surprising area, health and education. That's been a real source of employment growth over the past year. So that, as a sort of precursor to Friday, that's a little bit of a wake-up call. And
interesting.
I haven't seen any real evidence of large-scale layoffs, but it does seem that the employers are now going to pause and maybe not hire anybody. Yeah. Like put no new costs on the books.
Right.
So that would make me worry about Friday's number.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to wait and see.
The good news is I don't do Friday's number, so it's Fred Ashton's problem. I get to comment on it.
Yeah, his guesstimate's probably going to be a tough one this week for him for sure.
Well, major corporations have basically said, we can't give you an earnings guidance because we don't know what's going to happen. But we're not letting Fred off the hook. We want
to know. No excuses, Fred. So tariffs obviously are playing a big role in a lot of the economic data we're having. Actual or threatened.
Yes.
The threatening obviously creates uncertainty. So it's contributing to all of that economic uncertainty. What kind of impact, I know we've talked about this many times, but the impact on consumers and businesses is obviously large.
Yeah. It's, tariffs are a national partial sales tax, and it's paid by all purchasers, consumers, and businesses. So it shows up ultimately on the consumer tab after businesses pass it through. They don't pass through 100% the first day, but it gets there pretty quickly. So this is going to be hardest on the small businesses who are generally more cash constrained and have trouble getting the financing for big ticket. More trouble getting the financing for big ticket items. And if you're in a high interest rate environment, it's harder to do. Small businesses, employ half the people in the labor force, and they have the bulk of capital expenditures. And so if you look at that traditional profile of a downturn led by business investment, household spending following, the big shock on small businesses is the thing I'd worry about the most.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, with these reports this week, the continued threat of tariffs and all that, the R word is back on the table. I mean...
Oh, well, look, I've been worried about a recession since the announcement of all these various plans, but certainly one look at what he did on Liberation Day, which was much more aggressive than I had imagined. If I said to you, hey, let's raise taxes $450 billion, you'd say, Doug, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Calling it a tariff instead of a tax doesn't change the fact that it's a big headwind to economic growth.
Yeah, I like keeping a lot of my money in my bank account as much as possible. So,
well,
if you instituted a tax here at AAF, I have to say I'd probably walk.
Well, this podcast is kind of a tax.
That's a mental tax. That's different.
Okay.
So the Federal Reserve meets next week.
Yes.
A couple of bank presidents have been out there saying that June they're going to move rates, but we don't know when or which
what
way.
direction. Right.
Which way, not when. Which way. What are the options in fighting inflation and keeping the economy afloat?
This is probably can be reduced to rates up, down, or staying the same. Up means they're weighing in against the inflation risks and keeping that under control. So remember, in the Fed's view, what should happen if there are large-scale tariffs is the price level should go up. That's a one-time thing, and then they should go back to targeting 2%. But that means that there's a period as that price level goes up where there's rapid inflation. The question is, can you identify that, and when do you know when that part's done and you have to be stopping it? I have seen estimates that the price increase is going to generate inflation from anywhere from, say, 4% to 5.5% at the peak, and then they want it to go back to the 2% target. I think it's going to be really unpopular if we start seeing 4 and 5% inflation again. That's going to be an issue. So they may choose to raise and push hard against that. But that if we're already facing a recession and they're raising rates, that gets worse.
Yeah.
So there's no win. The trouble is there is no good option for the Fed. They can not worry about the inflation and ease rates, and that might help on the unemployment front. But the inflation, they run the risk of being blamed for that. So, they're earning their money this year. There's no doubt about it.
That's quite the rock in the hard place situation for them.
Absolutely.
All right, I've let you off the hook for weeks now on the trivia, so I'm bringing it back.
Okay, well, I can be wrong. Even well rested, I can miss that.
A Sanders-style single-payer healthcare system would increase federal spending by how much over the next 10 years?
Over the next 10 years.
Wrote about this, and
I know. Oh, what did we end up with? A Sanders-style. $70 trillion.
So in the dish you had 44, which was
it depends
very
which
similar
one.
to the Harris number. So this was similar to the Harris plan.
Yeah.
So so this was the Steve Parenti study that he did during the campaign.
Right.
And that's also so that was sort of the baseline.
Okay. Well, that's a cheaper one.
Yeah. Sanders one. I'm sure he's got way more expensive one too.
Yeah, he has a much richer array of benefits. So, but anyway, I think that rounds to 70. So,
a trillion here, a trillion there.
But the real issue here is the money. Yes, I get that. We can't put that on the federal budget. We can't afford that on the federal budget.
Yeah,
you have to finance it, and that means taxes that no one wants to pay. But the question is, what problem are you solving? Mm-hmm. And it's important to remember that Sanders is fond of saying, look, we spend all this money on health and we have the worst health in the world. Our outcomes are horrible. Well, 80% of that is things like your genetics and your diet and your exercise and your prevention, and 20% of it's the actual acute care healthcare system. And so, our bad health isn't going to change with a single payer, because people are probably still going to have the same genes, and they may have the same diet, and they may have the same exercise, and it's so I'm baffled by the attraction of this.
Yeah, I know this is the point you guys have been trying to make in your reality checkup pieces that you've been doing, that you and Michael have been sort of spearheading. But yeah, so it's been interesting to just follow and have this conversation, especially in the backdrop of the oligarchy tour going on, and which is very poorly named in my mind. But they like that word for some reason.
Well, I mean, I just wonder if there's a stop in Venezuela.
So, anyways, Doug, thanks for joining us, talking about all this stuff, talking about the first 100 days, talking about the economy. I'm sure the next 100 days are going to be just as eventful, and we'll have a lot more to talk about.
Absolutely.
All right, Jordan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Been a few weeks, but I'm sure you've been busy with with following reconciliation and all of the different proposals being put in there.
I have, yes. It's been quite a time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Following Congress is always, always has its, it's always has its ups and its downs. We'll leave it at that. Congress is back in session this week, though.
Yeah.
And reconciliation is right back in the spotlight. So start by giving us a quick reminder of what happened right before lawmakers went on recess.
Yes. So right before Congress adopted the fiscal year 2025 budget resolution, which essentially unlocks the pathway for reconciliation legislation to implement some of President Trump's domestic policy agenda. So it basically unlocked the pathway for Congress to craft that one big, beautiful bill that policymakers and the president have been talking about for months. So a quick overview, just as a quick refresher, budget reconciliation is essentially this special legislative process that allows legislation in the Senate to pass with a simple majority. So it basically gets around the 60-vote threshold that would be needed to overcome the filibuster in the Senate. It allows legislation to be essentially passed on party lines. So the budget resolution unlocked the pathway for that. And what it did was it includes reconciliation instructions for 10 Senate committees and 11 House committees to draft policy changes to meet a specific target. Some of the committees are instructed to draft measures that'll increase deficits on net over the next decade, and some are instructed to craft measures that will reduce deficits over the next decade. And in total, the House portion would allow for $2.8 trillion of net deficit increases over the next decade. The Senate portion would allow for $5.8 trillion. So after that was enacted, or adopted, I should say, it's not enacted, the president doesn't sign it into law, lawmakers are now hard at work crafting the actual measures to meet their actual targets as specified in the budget resolution.
So quickly, because I just remember there was some confusion around how the House dealt with, did they get on the same page with their resolution? How did that all work out?
They didn't. So a big issue is how the budget resolution is going to be scored, whether they're using a current law baseline or a current policy baseline. So the House is using a current law baseline. So they're essentially assuming current law, that means the Trump tax cuts expire as scheduled and they're not extended. So when CBO eventually goes ahead and scores the bill, it's going to be scored against a current law baseline, whereas the Senate adopted a current policy baseline, which is basically this gimmick where they're assuming that extension of the Trump tax cuts cost effectively zero. So that's why you're seeing the discrepancy in the two numbers.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. So Speaker Johnson has said that, of course, the House is going first in all this. Speaker Johnson has said, the four big committees, the ones that we're keeping our eye on during this, will begin their markup next week. Sometime. Still, some of them haven't announced the exact date yet. So what are the key items still being negotiated as they begin markup?
Yeah, so all eyes are on the House. The House is kind of taking the lead on this. There hasn't been really any traction in the Senate yet on this. This week alone already, 7 of the 11 instructed House committees have already put out their reconciliation measures and started markups of those. They're not really the exciting ones. It's committees like the Armed Services Committee, Homeland Security, Judiciary, Education and Workforce, Financial Services, and Transportation and Infrastructure committees. The big ones we're waiting to hear from are obviously the Ways and Means Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the Agriculture Committee. So Ways and Means has an instruction of $4.5 trillion, so they can increase deficits by $4.5 trillion over the next decade, and that's where you're going to see the tax portion of this bill. It's going to be, the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, as well as the tax proposals that President Trump proposed during the 2024 campaign. So that includes things like no taxes on tip, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security benefits. Press reports indicate that the Ways and Means Committee is pretty much drafted their section of the reconciliation bill, but they're waiting to see where the other committees land before they actually put their legislative text out. And part of that is because there's a caveat to the $4.5 trillion instruction. So the House is aiming for $2 trillion of spending reductions, but if they can't meet that $2 trillion target, the Ways and Means instruction is going to be reduced to offset that difference. So say, for example, the House can only come up with $1.5 trillion of spending reductions, you're going to see the Ways and Means instruction reduced to $500 billion to meet that, to accompany the difference. Johnson would like the Ways and Means Committee to do its markup of the bill next week. We'll see what happens. A key sticking point in what's going on with the tax negotiations, there's a lot of discussion around the state and local tax deductions. So the TCJA put a temporary cap on the SALT deduction at $10,000. Now that provision is set to expire at the end of this year. Some Republican lawmakers in high tax states in New Jersey and California would like to see the deduction increased, but you have other hardline conservatives that's a non-starter for them, and that's a non-negotiable for them. They want to see the cap stay where it is. And then in the Energy and Commerce Committee, that's another one we're going to be paying a lot of attention to. They're instructed to craft measures that would reduce spending by $880 billion over the next decade, and that's where you're going to see any changes to Medicaid. I'm sure you're seeing a lot in the news about potential Medicaid cuts. There's a growing wariness within the GOP about how deep those cuts could actually be. The big proposal that was being floated was to reduce federal reimbursements for Medicaid to states that had expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Some in the GOP are saying maybe that's going a little bit too far, and maybe an alternative proposal would be to just establish per capita caps on federal spending for Medicaid. And then the other one that I'm going to be paying attention a lot to is in the Agricultural Committee. They have an instruction to reduce deficits by $230 billion. And a big change that they're eyeing is a change to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
SNAP program.
Exactly. And the biggest change would be to shift a greater percentage of the cost of the program to the states, but the White House has said that it won't support such a proposal, so the Ag Committee is kind of waiting to see if House leadership reduces their instruction from $230 billion, given this latest development from the White House. And I should also note, Speaker Johnson was pretty adamant for a while that the goal was to get this big, beautiful bill to the president's desk by Memorial Day. Within the last decade, the White House has kind of pushed back that deadline now to July 4th for the bill. So we'll see.
That really does seem ambitious to try and get the Memorial Day, but it still seems ambitious to try and get to the 4th of July, especially because waiting in the background of all this is, of course, the Senate bird rule and all of those fun little quirks the Senate has to go through and all this.
Yes, I mean, and if they don't address the tax issue by the end of this year, we're looking at the biggest tax increase on a majority of Americans.
Yeah, because the TCJA expires at the end of this year.
It does.
So there is a clock on this.
Exactly, there is.
The other clock that they've sort of injected into this is, of course, the debt ceiling portion of this, which is a whole other storyline in all of this as well.
Exactly. So it includes a $4 trillion increase in the debt limit. Treasury is slated to come out with its estimate of the X date of when we're actually going to hit the debt limit. CBO says it's going to be August or September. I'm interested to see what Treasury says, but that will be another fiscal speed bump that we'll need to contend with as well.
So this is like it happens every 4 years essentially. So this is like your Olympics almost.
Exactly.
Like, you'll be glued to the C-SPAN as markup continues and all of that. So well, thanks for coming on and talking to us about this. I'm sure we're gonna get tired of talking about this as we invite you back on to the future podcast as well. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.